Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Examined Life with Phil. This is the third part of my discussion with David Pallman on intelligent design. In this one, we spend the most time on his critiques of young Earth creationism and theistic evolution, so we'll just get right into that and pick up right where I left us off last week. Well, getting back from the sidetrack there, are there any other critiques of ID that you are aware of and want to respond to? These are the common ones that I've heard cited all the time, so...
Yes, and I think you hit like the ones that we hear from scientists and atheists and theistic evolutionists pretty well. There is one I want to respond to that comes from mostly young Earth creationists, and particularly those in a reformed sort of presuppositionalist apologetics camp, right? And this is kind of a philosophical objection. But basically it asserts that intelligent design has no answer to the problem of evil, and that we need the revelation of Scripture, particularly the story of the fall as recorded in Genesis chapter 3, to make sense of the problem of evil. Now, I would raise 4 points to that. The first is that the problem of evil is a problem for all theists, regardless of what view we take on origins. We all have
absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we all have to reconcile. We all have to reconcile a good God with evil in the world. So in some ways, I think it's just kind of irrelevant to the discussion of whether design is present in biological systems. Second, intelligent design is a theory of biological origins, so it's primarily concerned with scientific evidence. That doesn't mean, however, that someone who holds to ID cannot also use the Scripture to answer sort of these questions that lie beyond biology, like why do we suffer? There's really no contradiction between intelligent design and Scripture, so you can use intelligent design and also use Genesis 3 if you want. There's no reason you can't do that. And then third, the problem of evil only applies to a God who is good. However, ID as such, like mere intelligent design, doesn't tell us if God is good or not. An amoral God or an evil God can still design things. So as far as intelligent design in its rawest form is concerned, God can be evil and his intelligence can still remain detectable in the world. So it doesn't apply to intelligent design. An atheist can raise the problem of evil, and that's not going to negate that intelligence is present, because you could have the possibility of an evil God. And then fourth, I'm just okay. Sorry. So fourth, I'd say I'm just not convinced that simply citing Genesis 3 answers the problem of evil anyway. I mean, saying that God cursed the entire earth and that so therefore we suffer because Adam sinned, that just seems to raise more problems than it solves to me. The whole point of the problem of evil is that, we need a solution to how God can be good and how pain, suffering, and moral evils in the world can all exist. So just citing Genesis 3 doesn't answer any of those questions, and it kind of adds another one, namely how is God good and just to judge everybody and make us all experience pain for something that Adam did? Now, of course, the presuppositionalists might just say, well, God can do whatever he wants, but then, why bother referring to Genesis 3 in the first place? Because, we can just answer the problem of evil by saying God can do whatever he wants. And to be clear, I'm not saying that, there aren't answers to these questions, but I just think appealing to Genesis 3, I think that just adds another question to it. It doesn't actually answer anything.
It, so to speak, takes the problem and pushes it back a step, but it's still there.
Yeah, and what? I mean, not even that. I don't even know if it pushes it back a step. It's just adding another one into it. Because now you're saying the reason that we suffer is because God is making us suffer because of something we didn't even do. Well, it's great. Now I don't just need an explanation for how God can be good, but I also need an explanation for how he's just in doing that. So it's kind of like a non-answer to just cite Genesis 3.
Yeah, that's I did a whole long series on the various responses to the problem of divine foreknowledge, and that was one of the objections I had to the Reformed or Calvinistic view is it seems that God's punishing me for things which I have no control over, which is unjust, and I know God's not unjust, therefore I see something wrong with the view. So
Right. or even if, you just want to do what Calvinist presuppositionalists do and say, well, who are you to answer back to the potter? He can do whatever he wants. But then that just kind of negates the whole reason that we're bringing up Genesis 3 in the first place, which is supposed to answer the problem of evil. If that's true, what you're saying, we don't need an answer to the problem of evil. The reason we suffer is because God wants us to. So, it doesn't seem to help anything.
Okay, yeah. The other thought I had while you were talking there about how this could be compatible with an evil god is that's reminded me of Stephen Law's Evil God Challenge. Have you heard of that?
Yes. I've seen it.
Okay, yeah. And I thought, well, yeah, ID is perfectly compatible with an evil god. In and of itself, it would be at least. So, okay.
Yeah, it would be. To be clear, I'm not arguing that God is evil or anything.
Yeah,
but
of course.
I'm going to appeal to other things like the ontological argument and the moral argument and a revelation of Scripture and Jesus Christ himself to argue, well, this is how we know that God is good. But no one argument for God gets you all of his attributes. Say the moral argument, maybe not get you to that God is all powerful or something. So intelligent design, if you're going to use this in natural theology as a teleological argument, it's not going to get you to that God is good. That's not an attribute of God that evidences.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. Okay, well, were there any other critiques you wanted to look at or respond to, or was that the last one?
No, that was the last one I had, sir.
Okay, fantastic. So why don't we move on to looking at other viewpoints? So what would be your general critiques of young Earth creationism? And you don't have to necessarily go very far in depth if you don't want to, but why is that a viewpoint that you wouldn't hold to?
To be clear, it is something that's compatible with intelligent design. So,
okay.
To some extent, it's not something that I'm completely opposed to for the purposes that we're discussing here. Why I personally don't hold to it is I don't think there are really good scientific reasons to. The scientific arguments offered in support of it, I think, are not that good, and the scientific arguments against it, like starlight, for example, or ice cores. Carbon-14 dating of the Earth's crust, that we have all these different lines of evidence telling us that the Earth is quite old. The fossil record in and of itself, or just we were talking about human evolution a little bit before, and I mentioned I don't believe that apes and humans share a common ancestor, but humans have undergone a lot of change, right? Like Neanderthals, they were people like us, but they looked a bit different. They were a bit bigger, and they had a different skull shape. Homo erectus, he was another type of human, I believe. So we've had quite a bit of change go on, and I'm not convinced that a 6,000 year period can really accomplish the level of change that we're seeing in the fossil record. Add to that, the humans don't even appear in the fossil record until 2 to 5 million years ago. There's some debate about that. I think a generally accepted date would be 2 million years ago. So you've got millions of years of history, and I know they want to attribute that all to the flood, but I would agree with a lot of what Michael Jones said last time, that their explanations for this, you had these stupid creatures who sat on the bottom, and the smarter ones climbed up higher and higher, and so that's these just don't strike me as being convincing. Kent Hovind, and some people have tried to appeal to, well, this is how water settles. You get these layers, right? And they've tried to explain how animals would fall into the spots where they are, based on their weight. But it turns out that doesn't work either, because our earliest creatures in the fossil record are just little small organisms, little sponge embryos, things like that. And the latest ones are things like human beings. Well, the really big ones, like the dinosaurs, appear nearer the top, but sort of in the middle, right? So it doesn't seem to be however the flood would have, jumbled everything up. It doesn't seem to have done it based on size or weight or anything like that. So it just doesn't look how we would expect this to look. So then that still leaves the problem of the fossil record for young Earth creationism. And I just don't see any need to go there from the Bible. I mean, I think any young Earth creationist, when it ultimately comes down to it, doesn't believe in young Earth creationism because the scientific evidence tells them so. It comes from this belief that the Bible necessitates that view. And I mean, I'm fine with them believing that, but I think that, they need to stop making this distinction between old Earth creationism and biblical creationism. Both views are compatible with the Bible. If you think yours is best, that's great, but it's not required by the Bible. There are many, many ways that you can get an old Earth out of Genesis, even reading it literally. So, yeah, sorry, I went on a little bit of a monologue there, but...
Oh, no, that's no problem. I couldn't agree with you more. I think that most of the reasoning that young Earth creationists give to try and explain away the fossil record tends to be like textbook examples of bad, ad hoc reasoning. It's just so obvious that that's not something that you would ever apply anywhere else, and that's... Ad hoc reasoning is one of the examples of what you don't do in inference to the best explanation, which is,
right.
To its credit, what ID theory attempts not to do is to say, hey, we're looking for design everywhere. We're not saying it's here and not anywhere else.
Yeah, I mean, every view to an extent has its points of ad hocness, right? Like I'm going to get to the vitamin C pseudogene here in a little bit, and my explanation for that may seem a little bit ad hoc, but you have to look at this in the greater picture. I'm looking at this in the picture of the whole fossil record and stuff. So if we had some really good arguments for a young Earth, and we had these few points that look like an old Earth, I might be okay with a little ad hocness, but that's not what we're getting. We're getting mountains of evidence for an old Earth, nothing that impressive for a young Earth, and then we want to explain away all this old Earth to fit an interpretation of the Bible that I don't even think is required by it.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things that pretty much convinced me that the world is pretty old is just geology. I mean, go to I grew up in Montana. Go to Glacier National Park, and you look at the mountains that are there. There's layers of sediment that were laid down. Then the mountains got pushed up by plate tectonics. Then the glaciers came and cut them out. Maybe you don't have to appeal to the world being a couple billion years old to explain that, but it certainly is going to take a lot longer than 10,000 years to do that kind of thing. So There you go. Okay.
No, you're right.
Yeah. Oh, the other point on what you were saying there, I've heard it said of young Earth creationists that in a certain sense, although they would absolutely resist this characterization for obvious reasons, that they're kind of like hyper-evolutionists, because they say that all these various changes in speciation actually had to happen very, very, very quickly. Like all the species of dog we have now, including wolves and possibly foxes, had to descend from just two pair of animals that Noah had on the ark in the last, depending on how they date it, 4,000 to 8,000 years or something like that, which, from what we know of how change happens, is almost certainly impossible. So they would resist that characterization for obvious reasons, but it's almost like they're saying they have even more faith in speciation and mutation and natural selection and things along those lines than even people who are theistic evolutionists do.
No, yeah, I mean, that's a good point. It kind of gets back to what I was getting back to. I know I was using the fossil record, but it gets back to that same point when I was talking about the different variations among, say, modern humans with Neanderthals and Homo erectus and stuff like that. Because, yeah, you've got to have this change happen in a pretty short amount of time, and we know that, natural selection and speciation, Darwinists will be the first ones to agree that this works really slowly. But now, I mean, the young Earth creationists, you're right. They want to say, oh, it actually works faster. Well, that's kind of counting against your view now, because you're giving the evolutionists, I guess, ammunition, if you want to say there.
Well, yeah, and it also seems to me like it's an inconsistency, because this probably wouldn't apply to everybody who's a young Earth creationist, but I've certainly heard some of them will attempt to make some of the same critiques of evolutionary theory that you're making here and say, well, it doesn't work for these and these and these reasons. But then they'll turn around and say, all the species of dogs and related canine species we have descended from 2 dogs that Noah brought on the ark for somewhere like 4,000 to 8,000 years ago. And you want to be like, well, no, you can't have it both ways. It's one or the other. So
yeah, and this kind of brings up another problem I have with young Earth creationism is a lot of them will appeal to this sort of like God made it look this way, right? So God made the universe look really old, or God made these creatures speciate really fast. My dad is a young Earth creationist, and he believes that God like supernaturally separated the races of people, right? That's how you got Africans and Asians and Europeans. Is that like God literally like did this separation between Shem, Ham, and Japheth, and that's how we have African Americans and Native Americans and Caucasians. And my problem with these is it almost makes God into this deceiver, because he's like making us think the Earth is old by the data that he's giving us in science, but then on the other hand, he's revealing to us and insisting that we believe that it's young, and so we get a God who looks like almost like duplicitous, and and kind of get a picture like the Muslim God, Allah, who brags about being the greatest of deceivers.
Yeah, exactly. My dad's a young Earth creationist as well, and he and I have discussed this. But fortunately, he's a good enough guy and a good enough Christian that he and I can have gracious discussions about this, where we don't get at each other's throats and argue that the other's not a Christian or something like that, which is wonderful. But yeah, that's one of the objections I have too. I mean, when I was growing up in Montana, my dad was there, and he was there in Glacier National Park with me and stuff like that. And I'm thinking, well, look at all these layers of rocks you see in the mountains. How can you look at that and not think this looks old? So if you're going to say that God made it 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, like you're saying, it's like that turns God into kind of a deceiver, which you definitely don't want to say our God is, because that would be wrong. That's not the way God is. So.
Oh, yeah, I couldn't agree more.
Okay, good deal. Well, before we move on to theistic evolution, did you have anything else you wanted to say about young Earth creationism, or does that pretty much cover it?
No, that's basically it. I'll just say this: like, for people who are convinced that only the young Earth view is, the correct one, I would honestly just encourage you to read Genesis itself. It is not in there. You cannot get a young Earth out of Genesis. Now, you'll get that from adding genealogies together and say, oh, well, this is about the age that we get. But just consider first of all, these genealogies are almost certainly not written to give you the age of the Earth, right? So even if the Earth is 6,000 years old, that's not the intention of the authors in writing this. So God is not trying to give you, Frank Turek puts it this way: when you get to heaven, the first thing God says to you isn't going to be, "Did you think it was young or old?" So this is not a big issue. But if you actually read Genesis, you realize there's this little verse that doesn't get a lot of attention from young Earth creationists, but it's Genesis 1, verse 2, which describes this time where the Earth is barren and void, and this is before day one of creation. So you have, and that's not the only way you could reconcile an old Earth with the Genesis account, but you can read the completely literal way of you could read Genesis completely literally without adopting a young Earth. So I would just encourage them explore those possibilities.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more there. I think the early chapters, the first chapter or two of Genesis, is actually in and of itself open to multiple different coherent interpretations. I think you can read it and coherently find a young Earth interpretation, but I think you can also read it and coherently find an old Earth interpretation and many other things, because it just doesn't give you a date there. So.
Yeah, I agree.
Okay, cool. Well, let's move on to your critiques then of theistic evolution. From our discussions when we were prepping for this, you don't consider yourself a theistic evolutionist, even though, as you talked about earlier, possibly at least some aspects of evolutionary theory are compatible with ID theory. So how would you define theistic evolution, and then what are your critiques or problems with it?
Well, so I have a problem with any type that is, going to be opposed to intelligent design. So if you hold to a theistic evolution, that is, you hold to like common descent or something, and you believe that God was directing this and that we can see his hand, I'm not going to have as big a problem with that. I'm going to disagree on scientific grounds, but I think, that's okay. That's, you can fit that with scripture, and you might, be able to have some scientific support for that, even though I would still have some problems with that. But the type of theistic evolution that I'm opposed to is definitely neo-Darwinian theistic evolution, and really any type of theistic evolution that believes that the forces of nature are sufficient to account for all of the complexity that we see in biology. Anything that says that God's hand or a designing hand can't be detected in this is what I'm opposed to. So that's normally going to be neo-Darwinism that says mutation and natural selection are sufficient to accomplish this. And even though, we believe by faith that God was directing this, we cannot detect that through science. That or anything that, maybe the mechanism isn't mutation and natural selection, like I think your guest, Michael, you would add things like horizontal gene transfer and things into that. But ultimately, it sounded to me like he was, saying that God's hand cannot be detected in this. And so that is what I'm going to be opposed to, anything that is going to remove the detectability of intelligence from that.
Okay. From what I understood of Michael Jones's his version of evolution that he subscribes to, he kind of thinks that God, so to speak, baked everything in from the very beginning. That is, and I hope I'm not mischaracterizing him here, but at the very beginning of the universe, at the very beginning of life, everything that would give rise to all the species and everything that we see now, all that information was right there from the very beginning, and then it developed therefrom.
Yeah, that's essentially his view. It's called process structuralism, and I'll offer a critique of that in a little bit here. I wanted to respond to some of his specific objections to intelligent design before critiquing his view. But yeah, you essentially have it correct. He thinks that when God created things, he built this into it. The problem I have with that, there's no way to detect that. You can't, you can hold that by faith, but he said that God directed it through natural laws. I believe that's almost a verbatim quote from him. Well, you can't detect design through natural laws. So on his view, it seems intelligent design is excluded.
Okay, yeah. I think that's a good, critique or criticism, in that it's sort of like, and I think Michael would probably try to resist this characterization of it, but it's sort of like having your cake and eating it too, where you're saying, well, it is natural, but God's involved too, even though we can only see the natural part.
Right, and this is a bit of a logical problem for anyone who holds to theistic evolution, and is saying that for all we can tell, naturalistic forces are sufficient to accomplish everything we see. But I believe that God was directing it. Now, God cannot direct an undirected process, right? That's just that would be contradictory. So now they want to say it only appears to be undirected, but God's actually directing it. It doesn't seem to make sense that there wouldn't be some way we could at least theoretically detect design. If it's being directed, that is, it's not a purely random process, it seems that theoretically there should be some way to detect design in this.
Yeah, it'd be like we would say then that sort of like God's hiding behind the natural processes that give rise to everything, where, yeah, he's doing it, but he's a few steps back where he doesn't want us to see what he's doing for some reason.
Right, like God buries his tracks, if you will.
Yeah, in fact, which would seem very odd. Yeah,
this raises up an interesting question, because atheistic evolutionists will usually be the first people to admit that life looks designed. Richard Dawkins defines biology as the study of complicated things that give the appearance of having been designed for a purpose. So atheistic evolutionists say things look designed, but they're really not. The irony is we have the theistic evolutionists telling us things don't look designed, but they really are. And so it's very interesting that the different, almost contradictory, stories we get about how biology looks from atheistic and theistic evolutionists.
Yeah, okay. Is that the bulk of then your general critiques against theistic evolution, or did you want to say anything more before? I know you wanted to respond to what Michael Jones had to say. And
that's my general critique of.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that would be my general critique of it, and I'll get into some more of it here. If it's okay, I'd like to just quickly answer. He gave 4 criticisms of intelligent design.
Oh,
and
yeah,
then
go ahead.
All right, yeah. So first he complained a lot that we are outdated in what we attacked. He gave this. Mm-hmm. I think he gave the analogy of we showed up for Napoleonic warfare, right?
Yep, exactly.
And so in a sense he's correct. I want to say we do spend an exorbitant amount of time attacking stuff that should have died a long time ago. The reason we keep attacking this stuff is because it still comes up. The evolutionists are still using Haeckel's embryos. They still show up in textbooks, even though these have been known to be forgeries. They still use fruit fly experiments. They still use Darwin's finches. And we have responded to this stuff over and over again. The reason we keep bringing it up is because they keep using it. Mm-hmm. So in a way, I'll say he's correct. We do respond to a lot of old stuff, but that's because we still have to, because they are still using it.
So in a certain sense, if you were going to say it very charitably, you would say that he's a much better opponent of this than the majority of the people you're responding to.
Oh, I would say so. I mean, I'm actually glad he doesn't hold to neo-Darwinism. Well, he doesn't completely reject it. I'm glad he acknowledges that it's insufficient. Mm-hmm. I think his view is more defensible than neo-Darwinism. I still think it has problems, and I will get to those. But I am glad that he's acknowledging that neo-Darwinism can't accomplish it.
Okay, good deal.
But yeah, we still respond to this. Because they keep bringing it up. My second point is just to respond to, you asked him if there was any specific evidences. He gave 3. The fossil record, human chromosome 2 fusion, and the vitamin C pseudogene. Now, 2 of these, the human chromosome 2 and vitamin C pseudogene, those only apply to ape to human evolution. So this is not going to be universal common descent, even if that's true. At best, that gets you from ape to people, which still fits with a polyphyletic view of life. It might mean there's more more plasticity within species than somebody like me would believe, but this doesn't by any means give you that all organisms are related. But first, to hit the fossil record, and I hit on this before. The fossil record is, in my opinion, the single most destructive piece of evidence against evolution. They have not given us a convincing explanation for the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is that's a general trend in the fossil record. We have the Avalon explosion. We have the Ordovician biodiversification event. We have all these different radiations of things where, animals and new forms just come into existence, as far as we can tell in the fossil record, with no discernible ancestors. Now, they will give us excuses, like Richard Dawkins and Francis Collins spend a lot of time in their book giving us excuses for why the Cambrian explosion doesn't look like what Darwinism would predict or what common descent would predict. Mm-hmm. Now, first of all, I don't think their criticisms work, but as I said before, you can't be using this as evidence for your theory if you have to give me excuses for why it doesn't look like it supports your theory. Mm-hmm. So I just find it ironic whenever evolutionists use the fossil record. Human chromosome 2, and this might get a little bit technical, but
I'm fine with getting very technical on this. I mean, I spent 2 podcasts just arguing about the ontological argument and all this technicality, so get as technical as you need to.
All right, I'll try to keep it the cookies on the bottom shelf, as it were. But basically, just to give a little background, humans have 1 pair of chromosomes less than chimps, right? I think it's 26 to 28. And apparently, one of these pairs became fused, right? And so when or at least that's what they say. They say it became fused, and this means we once had the same number of chromosomes as chimps, and so that implies that we share a common ancestor with them.
Mm-hmm.
Now, it's interesting because it's based on a difference, not a similarity. It's based on a different number of chromosomes that we have. And so the reason they think that this chromosome happened is because that this fusion event happened is because our chromosome kind of looks like it could be two fused together, and there's teleomeric DNA in it, which is what we have at the ends of our chromosomes. It's the type of DNA we have there. And so they say because there's teleomeric DNA there, that suggests that these have been fused together. So first of all, I want to say the evidence is less than conclusive that this fusion event has ever happened, right? The first point I would raise is that teleomeric DNA at the ends of our chromosomes normally consists of thousands of repeats, right? Like 2, 3, 4,000 repeats in the DNA. We don't have that in human chromosome 2. We have about 158 repeats, and that's an extremely low number if this is two chromosomes that have been fused together, which normally have thousands of repeats in their teleomeric DNA. We only got 150. We should have more than normal. We should not have less, but we have significantly less repeats than usual. Second thing is that these teleomeric repeats that do exist are highly degenerate. The teleomeric DNA there is diverged a lot from its original state, and that takes a lot of time. So if this fusion event happened recently, as presumably it did, because it would have to happen after the humans were split off from the chimps, we wouldn't expect this much degeneration to happen. Lastly, the teleomeric DNA is kind of common in mammalian chromosomes, so the mere fact that we have it in our chromosomes isn't necessarily an indicator that this fusion event happened. Now, all that is just to say that this chromosomal fusion that the whole argument is based on may not have happened. However, it could have happened. We will say that the shape looks like this might have happened, and I'm fine with saying that this fusion event happened. And then I would just say, so what? I mean, it clearly happened after we would have supposedly separated from chimps. So the fusion event itself tells us nothing, since it's equally compatible with the monophyletic view or a polyphyletic view. It's equally compatible with us being related with them or not. Now, maybe they want to point to the fact that we had once had the same number of chromosomes as them counts as evidence of common ancestry, but I would say that's really weak. I mean, we already know that we share a significant amount of DNA with chimps in the first place, that we have genetic similarity, right? I mean, we both are mammals, we both have a similar body structure, so there's going to be similarities there, and we already knew that just based on our morphology. We did not need we don't need to examine the chromosomes to figure that out. This is something we already knew. So say we once had the same number of chromosomes as chimps. I mean, okay, but that's not telling us that we were related with them. There's nothing inconceivable to me about humans and chimps both being independently created with the same number of chromosomes. I don't see a problem with that. And then he also used the vitamin C pseudogene. I'll say this is a stronger argument for common ancestry because this is based on a mistake, a supposed mistake that we share with them, right? Chimps would have had this. Well, most animals have a chromosome that makes vitamin C. Some don't, and that includes chimps, and that also includes us. We both have this thing that doesn't make vitamin C. So if you're going to hold to the position that I do, that they're not, then the theistic evolutionist says, well, that's kind of ad hoc to say that, this same mistake happened in both of you, right?
Yeah. I can see that.
So now I would raise just three things for consideration here now. First thing, this argument does hinge on that the vitamin C pseudogene or the GLO pseudogene is actually broken. This may not, in fact, be the case. I mentioned the ENCODE project earlier. Now, the ENCODE project has revealed that about 850 pseudogenes that were previously thought to have no function actually have function. We don't actually know of they transcribe into RNA and stuff like that. They don't build proteins, which is true, which is what they used to think all genes did, but that's not correct. Some are transcribed into RNA and perform other functions. So it is possible that the vitamin C pseudogene actually does perform a function and does something of this level. Now, let's take the assumption that it is in fact broken. It could very well be a coincidence that's broken between the two of us. Now, you might want to say that sounds ad hoc, but bear with me for a minute. The vitamin C pseudogene is not only broken in chimps and in humans. It is also broken in some species of bats, and it is also in guinea pigs. Yeah, sorry, that was the other one. Guinea pigs also have a vitamin C pseudogene that is broken. Now, bats and guinea pigs aren't considered to be very closely related to us, right? So if it seems that the GLO pseudogene, if it is in fact broken and doesn't perform some other function, this may just be a part of you that, a thing in animals that is somewhat more susceptible to breaking. Like, for example, in a car, if we have multiple cars that are, have the same, something that, maybe they get flat tires, which is a sort of a common-ish thing. Well, we don't say that means that the cars share a common ancestor. It just means this is a part of the car that's more susceptible to breaking.
Yeah, it wears down more. Yeah.
Right, and so it's entirely possible that the same thing is going on here. As John C. Sanford and Christopher Roop would say, it is not honest or consistent to infer that matching mutations in humans and primates proves common ancestry, while inferring matching mutations in humans and guinea pigs proves mutational hotspots. If the mutational bias argument is acceptable in explaining matching mutations in humans and guinea pigs, why isn't it acceptable to explain matching mutations in humans and apes? And then just thirdly, consider that the human Y chromosome is vastly different, both in its content and in its construct than it is from than in chimp one is. The human and the chimp Y chromosome is very different. So if the pseudogene counts as evidence for it, then presumably this should count as evidence against. As I say, this may seem a little bit ad hoc to some people, but at the very best, remember that only gets you to that apes and humans are related to each other. That's the best I can do. It does not get you to universal common ancestry. So yeah, sorry for the technical language there, but I think it was justified by the nature of that. So that was just to respond to those. Go ahead.
I was going to say, some things you just have to get technical on. That's perfectly fine. So I've got no problem with going in depth on technicalities here. So
I appreciate it. All right. Then I wanted to bring up this point that I found a little bit disturbing, frankly, was when he denied that DNA. When Michael denied that DNA was really information in any sense that we would think of it.
Yeah, he said it's not comparable.
I don't want to be rude.
Like yeah.
Yeah, I don't mean to be blunt or rude or obnoxious, but I mean he's just dead wrong on this. DNA is information in exactly the sense that we think of it. If we have information defined as a specific sequence of characters that gives rise to a function, and by the way, that is a dictionary definition of the term information, then DNA qualifies. This is how binary code, for example, works. And with DNA, it's the same. It's a specific sequence of nucleotide bases that give rise to new biological function. You don't have the right sequence, you don't get the function. So in that sense, it functions exactly like letters in an alphabet. Now, he referenced the paper Direct Prebiotic Pathway to DNA Nucleotides as some sort of evidence that DNA could self-assemble or that we're on the way to discovering that. Well, I looked up that paper, and all that we have evidence for is that we may be able to explain the origin of nucleotides, not DNA. Nucleotides are sort of like the letters, if you will, of DNA. So it's sort of like saying, oh, I found a Scrabble box. Look, now I can explain why the Scrabble letters are spelling something. Well, no, you can't. What we're inferring intelligent design for is the specific arrangement of these nucleotide bases, which are giving rise to the function, not necessarily that you found a way to get the nucleotide bases. So I don't think that I don't think you can really deny that DNA is information. I'll get into that later. But yeah, he brought up self-assembly, right? And
that fits with his model of evolution. That there would be self-assembly. Yeah.
Right. Well, we have good reason to suspect that you cannot get DNA by reference to self-organization. And the reason for that is that there are chemical bonds that take the nucleotide basis of DNA and they stick to the backbone of the DNA, right? So if you want to think of like magnetic letters on your refrigerator, there's an explanation, right, to why that sticks to the refrigerator, right? There's a magnetic force there. Mm-hmm. Well, it's kind of the same way with DNA. The nucleotide bases stick to the backbone. There's a chemical bond that forms there. However, there are no chemical bonds between the nucleotide bases themselves, right? Like the letters on the refrigerator, there's no magnetic force between the actual magnets themselves. So this is kind of disastrous for any view of self-organization that's going to say that laws or forces can accomplish this self-organization. Because from what we know about DNA, we know that what has to be explained, namely their specific arrangement, is not due to chemical bonds or any sort of chemical relationship. As far as the DNA backbone is concerned, the nucleotide bases can be arranged any way you want, and they will stick that way, so that there's nothing that's going to make these nucleotide bases assemble into the specific arrangement, and that's precisely what needs to be explained. That's what gives it its information-bearing properties, and that is what we invoke intelligent design as. Sorry again for getting technical.
No, that's no problem.
And then he gave a theological argument for the superiority of theistic evolution. He said God is more clever if he can set everything up to handle itself with no need for intervention. Now, to be clear, nobody denies that God has the ability to set everything up to unfold as he wants it to. God is omnipotent, so of course he has the ability to, work through evolution. I like what Philip Johnson said. He said, the question, could God have used evolution, is the most boring question a person could ask, because, of course, as soon as you say, could God, the answer becomes yes, because God is omnipotent. So the question is not, could God have used evolution, but the question is, did God use evolution? And to answer this question, I'm simply going to point to the mountains of scientific evidence against evolution that we've only touched on here. Mm-hmm. And now God may have very good reasons for not using evolution, for not acting through like laws or natural processes. Perhaps he wants his existence to be empirically detectable in nature. Romans 1:20 says, speaking of God, for the invisible things of him from the creation of the world are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Now, if theistic evolution is correct, God is not clearly seen by things which are made.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
God makes us, and then he sort of buries his tracks so that we would never know it. So I think God would actually have very good reasons to not use evolution, though he could.
Yeah.
So those are my...
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, finish your thought then. Go ahead.
I would say that's the end of my responses to his criticisms, and then I do have a brief critique here of process structuralism, but go ahead.
Yeah. Well, what you were saying there at the end reminds me, are you very familiar with the show Futurama?
I'm not, sorry.
Oh, okay. Well, it's a comedy and animated comedy that aired first, I think, on Fox and then on Comedy Central, and I think even on the Sci-Fi Channel for a while, but it tended to be pretty smart. Well, there's a episode of it where the robot character gets accidentally left or shot into space, and he meets essentially God, although he doesn't realize it's God at first, and eventually he gets back to Earth, and the God character says at some point in it, well, he's like conversing with this drunken alcoholic robot, which is, it's all very funny. But the God character says, if you've done everything right, people won't notice that you've done anything at all. And when I first heard that, I thought, oh, that's kind of clever. And then I thought about it some more, and I'm like, well, but that's not the God of the Bible who reveals himself in Revelation. I mean, that's like the opposite of what God wants to do. He wants to be noticed, at least to some degree or other. He wants us to interact with him and love him and things like that. So the God that you read about in the Bible is not going to take that mentality. Now, maybe a very deistic God who's the watchmaker who sets everything running and then hides would, but not the Christian God, at least.
And that's kind of what Michael's what Michael's view sounds like a sort of deistic I mean, I'm not saying he's a deist or has any sympathies that way, but that's kind of what it sounds like. This God who, doesn't want people to know he's there, so instead he sets it all up so that it unfolds. And now he wants to say, oh, well, that makes God, so much smarter and so much more intelligent. And, well, on the one hand, yes, but no one's denying that he can do that. We're saying that there's really good reasons, from the scripture as well as, just like natural theology and common sense, why he might not do it that way.
Yeah. Okay, well, why don't we then move on? What are your critiques of the extended evolution synthesis, or the newer variants of evolution that Michael Jones was getting into? Because I'll freely admit I found some of that compelling, because I've often had the thinking that I find a lot of the critiques that intelligent design makes of neo-Darwinism quite compelling, where I can see, this does seem to pretty much establish that mutation and natural selection absolutely does not work. Well, not absolutely, but doesn't work in the sense that it doesn't give us all the speciation and life variance that we see in the world. But at the same time, I've often thought there does seem to be pretty compelling evidence that a lot of the timeline of biology and stuff that you get in a lot of evolutionary textbooks does seem pretty accurate. That is, I think if you were on the world 300 million years ago, you'd probably see the later dinosaurs. 700 or 800 million years ago, you'd see the earlier dinosaurs. If you were on the world about 1.5 billion years ago, you'd probably see very primitive early forms of life, and so on, and therefore, like it's often presented, but that evolutionary theory, as it's generally understood in the Darwinian sense, doesn't seem to actually be a good mechanism for explaining all this. So when he said, well, there's all these other variants of evolutionary theory that are coming out that could explain all these things, I was like, well, finally, somebody's actually doing some work here that might explain all this stuff. So why don't you'd said you wanted to respond to that, so why don't you just get into that?
Yeah, so now there's a lot in the extended evolutionary synthesis, and I was going to respond specifically to his view. There's a lot there. A lot of this is still new. A lot of this is hypothetical. So, when we're talking about how much change can horizontal DNA transfer actually accomplish, it would seem like not much, because most horizontal DNA transfer happens with small microscopic organisms. Not a whole lot really is going to happen with big things. So, maybe that can get you a little bit further than neo-Darwinism, but I don't think that's going to, get you the full way either. But to specifically critique his view, because his view is that this comes down to laws, right? He thinks that God sort of fine-tuned the laws from the beginning to give rise to everything.
Yeah.
So now, first of all, that's very hypothetical, right? That God sort of front-loaded these laws to come about that way. There doesn't really seem to be any way to empirically, support or refute that. It's just like an idea that we, can't verify or falsify. But, since we don't have any reason to believe that in the first place, that makes me suspicious of it. Are there self-assembly laws in the nature of some things? Well, sure. Like he brought up snowflakes, but that doesn't mean that we have them for everything. Now, he has a video called "Was Life Inevitable?" that he has. It's like a 40-minute video that he has up on his channel. Where he kind of gets into some of the stuff on this. Very interesting stuff, but really, really speculative. He points to these experiments where we have some self-assembly going on, and then he makes these huge leaps in logic, it seems to me, to say, so maybe this can explain everything. And I mean, even he's using hypothetical language, maybe, possibly, and stuff. And I mean, again, I have nothing against hypotheticals, but at this time, that means that if this is only hypothetically can explain that, I mean, at this time, intelligence is still the best explanation until we give really hard data that this can support that, or that this can give rise to that. And then I'm just going to raise 3 basic objections here. 2 are in principle objections, and then an empirical one. So my first in principle objection is that laws don't cause things, right? Natural laws are descriptions of the way nature operates, but the laws don't actually cause anything. Now, on a more charitable interpretation, maybe Michael means natural forces rather than laws. Now that seems kind of vague to me to just say, oh, well, natural forces did this. I think he's got to give us some empirical data that such forces actually exist and are plausibly responsible for life. Then second, laws are just the wrong sorts of things to explain life, particularly the information in DNA necessary to build life, because laws describe regular and repeatable and predictable patterns in nature. Information, by the very nature of what it is just the opposite. Information is irregular and it's not predictable, because if it was, it wouldn't be informative. So natural laws are just the wrong sorts of things to give rise to the information that we see. So that's another in principle objection. And then as an empirical objection, we're wholly lacking data that, there are laws that can do this. So this is, just hypothetical stuff at this point, which, is all well and good. I'm not going to, say scientists can't pursue this line of thought, but until they got some data for us, I'm not going to go that route. And then he's still going to face the, empirical objections that I would raise against common descent from the fossil record and such that, even if we had such laws and, we could see them self-assembling things and, even giving rise to life, it wouldn't follow that this is therefore the way that life has developed. That would become a possible explanation, but we would still have to look at, the fossil data to say, well, is this in fact how life unfolded? And I think if we look at it, we see something that looks very polyphyletic, something that looks like a progressive creationist view almost, where we have new forms of life coming into existence suddenly without precursors. So that still has got to be faced even on this view. So that's it for my critiques. I could give a lot more, but that's probably enough.
Okay, yeah. And I remember thinking that was some of the critiques you were making there were similar to some of the thoughts I had where, some of this might work, but it is kind of, as you're saying, very, very speculative. But at the same time, part of me gets kind of excited about that because I've thought for a while, at least some of what evolutionary biologists are telling us as far as the timeline of how the history of life proceeded on Earth, that seems very, very solid. But why are you consistently holding to neo-Darwinism when it clearly doesn't work for all these things? So by all means, let's pursue some other theories and see if there's some viability there. So, okay.
Yeah, and I mean, intelligent design works, fine with the standard timeline of the Earth. We don't have a problem with that. What we would say is that we need intelligence interacting with this to get it done, that you can't have this accomplished through purely naturalistic forces or laws or whatever it is they want to posit, is that we're just wholly lacking data for that at this point.
Okay, well, that actually ties into a question that I've written down that I made a note of a while ago. Do you have an opinion on, then how this would have worked? I know a lot of intelligent design theorists, don't, because this can get a little bit speculative, but do you think is the case that then, God reached into the world, so to speak, and, created all the animals that were there in the Cambrian explosion, fully formed there at that time, and then he later did it for humans, and so on and so forth?
Sure. So that would be the view I hold, because theologically I'm a progressive creationist. So I believe that God did create these animals fully formed as we see them. Not that you don't get any diversification whatsoever that happens naturally through natural selection or whatever. I don't deny that there's any plasticity there, but I do think that this cannot be extrapolated to give rise to fundamentally new forms of life.
Okay.
Now somebody like Michael B. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, finish what you were saying there.
Oh, I was just saying, someone like Michael B., who does hold the common descent, could say that, that we have had this common descent, but natural forces don't accomplish this. So God kind of punches in new computer code, right? Gives new DNA, gives the new information that Darwinists, or just evolutionists want to say that natural forces accomplish. But God feeds that in, sort of in a computer, you put new code into your computer, you get a new function out of it. So, you could have common descent that's very, very compatible with intelligent design. As I said, I just have some empirical reservations about, that common descent is true in the first place. But if you are persuaded of it, then, you could hold to that view as well.
Okay, yeah, yeah. The only real trouble I'd have with that, and I know you would want to like appeal to the fossil record and say that gives evidence in favor of something like progressive creation, and I can see how that would be, is that almost seems, I don't know, something about that it strikes me as a little bit ad hoc to say that God steps in and then creates new organisms at this time for some unknown reason. And I don't really have that fully formulated like as a well thought out objection. It's just kind of something about that makes me want to like be a little bit hesitant to say, yeah, that's the way it goes, even though I can definitely see how you could appeal to some evidence in favor of that.
Right. So this is like a theological or philosophical question of like, why would God do it that way?
Exactly. Yeah.
Now, I tend to deal in the scientific evidence mostly. Is what I'm interested in, so I don't, do a whole lot of, why does he do it that way? I know, Reasons to Believe has a, with Hugh Ross has a whole theories and stuff that they have out there as to why God would do it this way, that this would confer benefits on us. If it's something you're interested in pursuing, I'll recommend you that literature. I'm not fully sold on, everything that Reasons to Believe puts out there, but I do think they at least give us, an interesting case as to why God might do it that way. But when it really comes right down to it, I'm really more interested in the that when we're talking about the science than the why. So I'm not going to say, well, because I can't think of a good explanation for why God would create creatures fully formed over long periods of time, I'm going to reject it for that reason and say that this evolutionary process that I don't really have super compelling evidence for is responsible for it.
Yeah, and I fully acknowledge that's, I wouldn't say that, as I've articulated at least, isn't a very strong objection. It's probably kind of more of a weak one. But it's just the thing that immediately comes to my mind when you talk about progressive creation like that. So, okay. Well,
Sure,
did you have anything else? Oh, go ahead.
And I will admit that this is one. No, yeah, you're fine. This is one weakness in that people will bring up with intelligent design is that we cannot articulate a full history of life the way evolution can.
Mm-hmm.
They can give us a mechanism, with how related things are in the fossil record. They can, predict, even though we don't have evidence for these transitional forms, their theory predicts that they would be there. So they can give us a much fuller picture of the history of life than intelligent design can. And there's a reason for that, of course, because of the way intelligent agents, act, right? Like, say you come into a house that's, nicely fashioned, you probably can't give the history of how it got fashioned that way. Whereas, if you see one that's all deteriorated by like rain and natural forces, and you can just sort of like, maybe the ceiling's hanging in or something, and you can see things on the floor that have fallen, you'll probably be able to give a much more like chronological view of what's happened, because that's how natural forces work. So we can see how these operate. Intelligent agents act in like sporadic and unpredictable ways. So to some extent, that might be what we would expect, that we wouldn't see this. So I will say intelligent design does not give you as filled out a history of life as evolutionary theory does. But at the end of the day, the question is not who gives us a better story, it's who's got the evidence. And I think that is, that's where intelligent design wins.
Okay, good deal. All right. Well, the last question I have for you here is, you've identified yourself as a Christian apologist, and I'm a Christian philosopher, so I think we see eye to eye on most things there. Is how do you then reconcile what's your viewpoint of old earth creation and intelligent design? How do you reconcile that with the first chapter or two of Genesis? Because it seems to me if you're going to be an Orthodox Christian, that's a problem you've got to face up to. Or maybe you don't even see it as a problem, but go ahead and explain that then.
Well, I'll say, to be clear, intelligent design is an age-neutral theory, so there is no intelligent design position on how to interpret Genesis. But personally, I take a progressive creationist view. And progressive creationism, which, by the way, has nothing to do with progressive theology or anything like that, it just means to believe that God created through a series of over time, through a series of creative acts. And we see the word day in Genesis. We see that it can be applied more broadly than simply a 24-hour period of time. So we take these days to be ages. There are a few hints in the text itself that these are not meant to be taken as 24-hour periods. For example, the seventh day on which God rested, that never ends. So we are apparently still living in that seventh day, which is quite clearly been more than a 24-hour period of time.
Yeah.
Moses is traditionally considered to be the author of Genesis, and coincidentally, he is also only the author of one psalm, or only has one attributed to him. That would be Psalm 90. And if Moses was ever going to give us any insight into how he understood the word day, Psalm 90 would be it. And Psalm 90 indicates that Moses himself didn't think that these were 24-hour periods of time, because he says 1,000 years is as a day to the Lord. Mm-hmm. So I think that, we have good reasons to not take these as being 24-hour periods of time, and so these can be, an indefinite period of time, and where God does his creative acts, and it more or less corresponds to, a traditional history of life. I mean, it's actually remarkable how well it fits into it if you look at it that way. Even if you consider other creation passages in the Bible as well, then we really get a remarkably accurate picture of creation that comports well, honestly, with what modern science is telling us. Now, even if you think these have to be 24-hour periods of time, that doesn't commit you to belief in a young Earth. As I said before, you have gap theory. These days don't have to be consecutive. So, there's just a lot of ways that you can read this without committing to a young Earth.
Okay. Good deal. Yeah, I agree with you there. It's I think I even mentioned this when I was talking with Michael Jones about this, where it seems to me that the first couple chapters of Genesis is very odd in that it doesn't really conform to any other genre of literature, where you read that and it seems like parts of it are very much historical, other parts of it are very much symbolic, like there's a lot of parallelism going on with the days there and a number of things like that, where some aspects of it appear deliberately constructed to give broader meaning. Some aspects of it seem to be very much deliberately constructed as like a narrative or a historical thing, and it's like a mix of all of them together. Unlike later chapters of Genesis, when you start getting into Abraham, where it's clearly intended to be like a historical narrative, which then leads me to say, well, it's then reasonable to, there's multiple interpretations you can take of this that are, at least on the face of it, reasonable. Like, it does seem to me like a young Earth reading of the early chapters of Genesis is just on the face of it reasonable. You can actually take that from the text alone, I think, even though I don't subscribe to that view myself. So.
Sure, yeah, and you can take a very literal view of it again without getting the young Earth view. But I mean, I'm not an Old Testament scholar, not by any means. So I'll be honest, it would not surprise me at all if Genesis was not intended to be written as historical narrative. If like John Walton's Cosmic Temple view, functionality view turned out to be correct, it would not surprise me, and it would be fully compatible with intelligent design. So I mean, I'm comfortable living with some ambiguity there. Not like saying that I don't desire to know what the correct answer is, but there doesn't seem to be any consensus view emerging on that, and I think there are much more important issues to be addressed. So I'm happy with devoting my time and research to, having studied this reasonably well, to know that I'm, don't have to commit to a young Earth view on this. And, if the young Earth view turns out to be correct, I mean, great, but intelligent design would still be correct. So, yeah.
That's a good point. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've had a pretty good, lengthy discussion here. Is there anything else you wanted to say about this before we wrap up?
No. I think I've said probably too much, but yeah, I think I've said all that needs to be said.
No. Okay. Well, before I close out here, I want to say that I really appreciate that you actually listened to the discussion I had with Michael Jones so you could respond to that. I think that made for this to be a much better podcast episode. So thank you for doing that. I really appreciate that.
Oh, my pleasure. I appreciate the opportunity to interact with Michael on this, actually.
Yeah. Okay, so last thing is, if people want to learn some more about ID, the work you're doing, or any other projects that you want to plug, where can they go? What's your YouTube channel or some other resources you would want to point them to?
Sure. So in my YouTube channel, Faith Because of Reason, I'm going through a series on intelligent design. It's supposed to be 8 parts. Thinking about extending some of the episodes, but for now it's set to be 8 parts. I've only made 2. The third one should be out. Episode 3 should be out shortly. I'm trying to condense the best arguments and most current scholarship for intelligent design into like 15 to 20 minute bite-sized pieces. Respond to like the major objections. I'm not going to hit everything, but I'm going to hit the major points, give you the strongest arguments for intelligent design. My videos are they're kind of like inspiring philosophy style, but it's me instead of him. And then for people who want to study this, proponents of intelligent design put a large body of literature out there. If you're a beginner, I recommend starting with books like Understanding Intelligent Design by William Dembski and Sean McDowell, Heretic: One Scientist's Journey from Darwin to Design by Matt Lazzola and Jonathan Witt, The Politically Incorrect Guide to Darwinism and Intelligent Design by Jonathan Wells. If you're really looking for like the best case available for intelligent design, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, both by Stephen Meyer. The Design Inference, Intelligent Design, The Bridge Between Science and Theology, and the Design Revolution by William Dembski. Darwin's Black Box, The Edge of Evolution and Darwin Devolves by Michael Behe, and The Design of Life by William Dembski and Jonathan Wells. For some critiques of evolution, some common arguments used in favor of it, I recommend Icons of Evolution and Zombie Science, both by Jonathan Wells. Science and Human Origins by Ann Gager, Doug Axe, and Casey Luskin. And then for some critiques of theistic evolution, I recommend Theistic Evolution, a scientific, philosophical, and theological critique. If you can only get one book, get that book. It's a 1,000-page critique of theistic evolution in particular, but really of evolution in general, because about half of the book is dedicated to the science on it. It's 1,000 pages. So that's 500 pages of critique of the scientific evidence offered in support of evolution. It addresses extended evolutionary synthesis, and it's just really good. In the philosophical case, it does a number on like methodological naturalism and things, and of course the theological critique is also interesting for those of us who are Christians. God and Evolution, edited by Jay Richards. Should Christians Embrace Evolutions, edited by Norman Nevins. And just stay up with the latest developments. evolutionnews.com is where I would recommend. So yeah, that's okay. Those are my recommendations.
Yeah, and I can echo your recommendations of Darwin's Doubt. I've read about 95% of that book, and my wife actually bought me Theistic Evolution, a critique for my birthday, not this year, but last year. So both very good books. Okay, fantastic.
You need to get reading, Phil.
Say what?
You need to get reading on that one, Phil.
Oh, there's just so much stuff to read. I can never get to all of it. I've worked my way through. Started working my way through that one. Yeah, that's just the problem with the world. There's so much good stuff to read. It's sad. I've realized I'm never going to read all the books I want to read before I die, even if I live to like 100. So what are you going to do?
I hear you.
Okay, good deal. Well, thanks for coming on again. Oh yeah. Pleasure. I think this was a very great discussion, and you give a lot of good information out for people to think about. So thank you so much. All right, so that's the extent of David and I's discussion on intelligent design. I don't know what happened to my mic toward the end there. It started sounding like I was underwater or away from the mic or something, but I was sitting right here this whole time, so I'm not sure what was going on with that. My apologies. The other thing I'll note is that David definitely recommended the most extra resources out of any guest I've ever had on the podcast. He gave the most book and website recommendations out of anybody we've had here, so I guess if there was an award to give out for that, he would get it. So before I go, I'm going to do another quick segment of Calvin and Hobbes and philosophy, because I missed it out on doing that last week, and it was a great tragedy, so it's time to do it again. So this week, I'll put the comic strip up on the Facebook page like normal, but I'll just tell you what's going on here. Calvin is in his bedroom sitting at his desk doing homework, and he's saying to Hobbes while he's got a book open in front of him, "Help me figure out this homework problem, Hobbes. What's 3 plus 8? And then Hobbes gets some scratch paper and starts writing. He says, "Okay, assign the answer a value of x. X always means multiply, so take the numerator, that's Latin for number 8er, and put that on the other side of the equation." Then the next panel shows Hobbes gesturing to Calvin with a pencil, and he says, "That leaves you with 3 on this side, so what times 3 equals 8? The answer, of course, is 6. And then Calvin just holds his head in his hands in despair and says, "Gosh, I must have done all the other ones wrong." And Hobbes is reading the book and says, "These problems seem awfully advanced for first grade, if you ask me." And so, obviously, the lesson here is that sometimes we make problems much, much harder than they have to be. We complicate things beyond necessity. We don't follow Occam's razor of looking for the simplest explanation. And that's something that I think a lot of people often think about these debates and issues surrounding creation, evolution, intelligent design and such, is they think, well, to really understand and critique this, I'd have to know this biology, this history of paleontology, this theological aspect, and so I don't have the expertise to look into all this, so I can't really have an opinion. And I don't think it really needs to be that complicated. Now, if you're going to try and critique something like, say, the way carbon-14 dating works, yes, you need to be an expert on that, and I'm certainly not an expert on that. But you don't necessarily need to have expertise in each one of these fields to look at all of the information involved and come to your own best conclusion. These aren't horribly advanced things for adults to figure out and think about. You certainly can. You don't need to overcomplicate it like a lot of people do, so I'd encourage you to do the opposite of what Hobbes is doing here, and don't overcomplicate it. Just find all the evidence, reasons, and arguments you can, and then come to your best conclusion. So that's the extent of the discussion on intelligent design. Let me know what you thought of David's critiques of young Earth creationism and theistic evolution. Let me know what you thought of the discussion on intelligent design in general. I thought it went pretty well in depth. I thought we covered a lot of good ground, and let me know your opinions on that. Next week, I'm going to have Peter Razor back on the podcast. He was on a few months back to talk about Molinism, and he actually co-authored a book called The Controversy of the Ages, Why the Age of the Earth Shouldn't Divide Christians. And so since that's very relevant to this topic I'm doing here, I asked him to come back on the program, and we had a pretty good discussion about that book. So he'll be back on next week. And in the meantime, write and let me know what you think. Let me know how you think the podcast is doing, what you like about it, what you don't. You can always reach me at theexaminedlifewithphil@gmail.com. Check out the Facebook group I started for the page. I'll have the Calvin and Hobbes comic up there, and I try and put up things periodically that are funny, interesting, or relevant philosophically or theologically. And if you enjoy the podcast, share it on your social media, share it on Facebook, or, God forbid, if you use Twitter, share it on there, but do yourself a favor and get off Twitter. But if you have to use it, at least try and share my podcast on there. Maybe try and use that awful platform for some good. And, give it a like or a rating on whatever's appropriate on the podcast service you use, whether it's iTunes, iHeartRadio, Spotify, whatever. So that's the extent of this week's episode, and I'll be back again next week for the first part of my discussion with Peter Razor on his book. Thanks.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.